David Fincher is widely regarded as one of the most respected and criminally underrated directors in modern cinema.
I think people are perverts. I've maintained that. That's the foundation of my career.
Known for his obsessive attention to detail with an almost surgical precision and his mastery of capturing tension through silent scenes and characters, Fincher is easily one of my favorite directors of all time. Well, next to this guy, and this guy, oh, and this guy too, but right after those three, we have David Fincher. But beyond this extreme precision and classic thrillers, how profitable have his movies truly been? In this video, we're breaking down the budget and revenue of every David Fincher film, exploring the backstories and the circumstances that made each one a box office success or a studio's worst nightmare. Alien 3 was David Fincher's first feature film, but this film almost broke him as a director, not because of the story he wanted to tell, but because of the chaos behind the scenes. Fincher stepped into Alien 3 after a long line of directors had come and gone, inheriting a production already drowning in rewrites, studio interference, and conflicting creative agendas. He was just 28 years old at the time, known primarily for music videos, and was suddenly handed a massive franchise film with no completed script, an inflexible production schedule, and a studio breathing down his neck at every turn.
My first movie, it's fairly well known, was a disaster. I stupidly felt that the people who were financing it had more to lose than I did if it was bad. I sort of allowed myself to be steered into this communal making, and then when the shit hits the fan, all of a sudden everybody scatters and you're the guy standing there going, wait, who's got a suggestion now?
Fox had their own vision for the film, and Fincher's darker, more nihilistic tone often clashed with what the studio thought Alien 3 should be. Some scenes were rewritten mid-shoot, and sets were built before the story was finalized. The production of Alien 3 is one of Hollywood's most infamous disasters. The studio constantly interfered with production, and major decisions were overridden, including casting, tone, and even editing. Fincher reportedly quit the post-production process before the final cut was complete, and has since disowned the film entirely. The budget for this film was a reported $50 million, a hefty price tag for the early 90s, partly because of its troubled development cycle, multiple abandoned scripts, and expensive set redesigns mid-production. Despite the behind-the-scenes chaos, Alien 3 managed to earn $160 million worldwide, thanks largely to the franchise's loyal fanbase and strong international performance. While Alien 3 wasn't the home run that Aliens was, it still turned a profit, tripling its production budget globally, even if it was a nightmare behind the scenes. The film received a 44% critic rating, with some praising its visuals and thematic ambition, especially Fincher's moody direction and the nihilistic atmosphere, while others blasted it for killing off beloved characters from Aliens in the opening minutes, calling it a betrayal of fan expectations. However, over the years, Alien 3 has gained something of a cult appreciation for its bold choices and haunting tone. This gruesome shooting experience left Fincher severely scarred. It was a brutal introduction to the politics of studio filmmaking, but in hindsight it shaped his identity as a director. It taught him a lesson he'd carry for the rest of his career, that was to never compromise on creative control again. And from that brutal beginning, Fincher would go on to make one of the most iconic thrillers of the 90s. The story of Seven follows two homicide detectives drawn into the twisted mind of a serial killer who orchestrates his murders around the 7 deadly sins. Brad Pitt plays Detective David Mills, young, impulsive, and eager to make a difference. He's partnered with the seasoned and cynical detective William Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, who's just days from retirement. Together, they navigate a bleak, rain-soaked cityscape, uncovering a series of gruesome crime scenes, each one more horrifying than the last. The climax of this film is a devastating twist that redefined what thrillers could be, leaving audiences stunned and cementing Seven as one of the boldest crime dramas of its era. Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman share a natural, fluent chemistry with each other. Their contrasting personalities allow them to clash, connect, and slowly develop a bond rooted in mutual respect for each other. It's this evolving relationship that grounds the film emotionally, so by the time the climax hits, their connection feels earned and genuine, which makes the final moments all the more devastating. This isn't just another random bad guy murder mystery. Instead, it portrays this drastic event as an indictment of the modern world. The killer isn't killing people at random. He sees himself as some sort of weird divine instrument, punishing people who represent the 7 deadly sins. After the nightmare of studio interference on his first film, Fincher was disillusioned, convinced he'd never direct another movie unless he had full control, but then he read Seven, which was written by Andrew Kevin Walker.
Fincher was and is incredibly collaborative. He's one of the people who considers, I always say if he had the patience, he could just write it himself.
The script was bleak, unapologetically grim, and deeply philosophical. The kind of story that didn't just entertain, but disturbed. Initially, the studio wanted to soften the script, sending Fincher a different version of the film, a version that didn't include the infamous box ending. However, when Fincher found out the original version had the gut punch finale, he fought hard to keep it in, and Brad Pitt also backed him up, threatening to walk if it was changed. Together, they forced the studio to keep the script intact, the way Andrew had originally written the story.
I got to where John Doe gives himself up, and I'm holding the script, so I know, most of the movie is gone, but there's still a good portion left, and the killer is walking into the police precinct to give himself up, and I thought, hold on, and I put myself in the position of the audience thinking, when that happens, if I'm sitting in a theater, I'm going to be extremely discomforted.
What makes Seven even more incredible is what it chooses not to show. The murders are never seen as they happen. The real horror is left to your imagination. Fincher forces you to fill in the gaps as the detectives describe each scene in detached detail, which only heightens the dread. It's not just what you see, it's what you can't stop imagining. Seven was made on a relatively modest budget of $33 million, especially modest considering the film's ambition and eventual cultural impact. Most of the money went into creating its gritty, rain-soaked atmosphere, stylized lighting, and meticulously designed crime scenes. The film wasn't effects-heavy, but it was detail-heavy, with Fincher obsessing over every frame to build tension without relying on cheap scares or spectacle. At the box office, Seven became a surprise hit. Despite being R-rated, relentlessly dark, and emotionally punishing, Seven became a massive hit. It grossed over $327 million worldwide, with more than $100 million coming from the US alone, and the rest from a strong international run. It outperformed expectations and went on to become one of the most profitable psychological thrillers of the 90s, earning nearly 10 times its budget. Seven currently holds an 84% critic rating. Even though some early reviews were uneasy with the film's darkness, most critics came to see Seven as a landmark in the crime thriller genre, a film that refused to offer clean answers or easy catharsis. Seven is a really great movie, a rare classic I would personally recommend to anyone. Today it's widely considered one of the greatest thrillers ever made, and the film that truly launched Fincher's legendary career. It gave Fincher more than just industry respect, it gave him freedom. No longer the new director with something to prove, he now had the clout to pursue stories on his terms, and his next project would reflect that completely. After the critical and commercial success of Seven, David Fincher was on fire. Studios were lining up, offering him blockbuster scripts and big names, but buried in a pile of projects was a psychological thriller called The Game, written by John Brancato and Michael Ferris, a script that had been floating around since the early 1990s. The Game tells the story of Nicholas Van Orton, a wealthy, emotionally cold businessman who has everything except real happiness. On his birthday, his brother gives him a very strange gift, an invitation to participate in something called The Game. But this isn't your typical family puzzle or outdoor adventure. The Game is an immersive experience that starts small, but quickly spirals into an intense and bizarre journey of psychological manipulation. Van's life starts falling apart, his finances, his relationships, even his sense of reality. The stakes get higher and higher, but the question remains, is this really a game? Or is someone truly trying to destroy him? The entire film is one big, unpredictable twist, with a jaw-dropping, mind-bending ending that'll leave you questioning everything. The film constantly blurs the line between reality and illusion, where nothing feels stable and no one feels trustworthy. Every moment forces you to question what's real or what's part of the game. Fincher masterfully amplifies that paranoia, pulling the audience into the same disoriented headspace as the protagonist, where control is just an illusion waiting to collapse. The Game had been circulating in Hollywood long before Fincher got his hands on it. Originally, The Game was written before Seven even happened, with Fincher chosen as the director, but the project stalled repeatedly due to casting issues and scheduling conflicts. Fincher was cautious due to the nightmare production he had already faced on the set of Alien 3, and the new empowerment of creative control he had gained from Seven. He wasn't going to take on a project unless he could reshape it into something truly his. The original screenplay had a strong concept, But Fincher wanted to dig deeper into the psychology, the symbolism, and the emotional collapse of the lead character. The game had a reported production budget of $50 million, and for a mid-90s psychological thriller, especially one without heavy special effects, this was a decent investment. Most of the budget went to location shooting, complex stunts, and the film's two major stars. At the box office, it earned approximately $109 million worldwide. On paper, the film doubled its budget, but the margins were much tighter once you factor in marketing and distribution costs, which likely added another $20 million to the budget. Many analysts believe the film either broke even or made only a modest profit during its theatrical run. However, where this movie truly found life and long-term profitability was in home media and cult rewatchability. Over time, the game became a staple recommendation in the psychological thriller genre, particularly for fans of cerebral twist-heavy storytelling. In other words, while the game wasn't a breakout hit, it wasn't a flop either. It was a slow-burn success, one that didn't light up the box office, but quietly built its audience over decades. The game currently holds a 77% critic rating, with many critics praising Fincher's ability to sustain tension from the first frame to the last. But while the game wrestled with questions of control and identity, Fincher's next film would rip that identity apart entirely, strip it down to the bone, beat it, bruise it, bleed it, and challenge the very fabric of modern masculinity. With Fincher coming off of the critical acclaim of the game, he was looking for another film that could push the boundaries even more. Fight Club is centered around an unnamed protagonist who suffers from chronic insomnia and a deep sense of emptiness. Our protagonist is fed up with his life, dead bored from consumerism, corporate life, and the meaninglessness of it all. In search of relief, he meets a guy named Tyler Durden, a charismatic soap salesman who introduces him to the underground world of Fight Club, a secret society where men gather to beat the crap out of each other as a form of therapy. But what begins as a release from societal pressure quickly escalates into chaos as Tyler's vision for the future becomes more radical. As the protagonist begins to lose control, the line between self-destruction and self-discovery vanishes, leading to one of the most iconic twists in film history. It definitely took me rewatching this film a few times and doing some additional YouTube homework to fully understand what the hell was even going on. The script for this film was extremely controversial. It explored masculinity, consumerism, and anarchy, subjects that many studios found troubling, and wasn't their typical recipe for box office success. It was heavily criticized for promoting violence and chaos, and although the studios hesitated, Fincher was immensely passionate about the story and fought hard to bring his uncompromised vision to the screen. But when this handsome mayonnaise signed on to play Tyler Durden, it gave the studio all the confidence it needed to greenlight the script. Fincher's approach to the film was all about deconstructing the American dream and playing with the concept of identity. The film's stark visual style, including gritty urban landscapes and unique camera techniques, was a perfect match for the story's themes. The production itself was ambitious. With an outstanding budget of $65 million, the film used pioneering digital effects, CG-enhanced tracking shots, and immersive sound design. Fincher wanted to visually represent the narrator's fractured psyche, creating a world that felt both real and disorienting. When Fight Club finally hit the theaters, it didn't land the way Fox had hoped. In fact, it was initially considered a box office flop. It grossed a modest $100 million at the global box office, a number that on the surface might seem decent. But with a production budget of $65 million and an aggressive marketing campaign that pushed total expenses even higher, the film barely managed to recoup its production costs. However, Fight Club managed to pull off one of the greatest second acts in modern cinema. Thanks to its home video sales, rentals, and its rabid cult following, the film eventually became a goldmine. It currently holds an 81% critic rating, with many early critics unsettled by its graphic violence, anti-consumerist messaging, and radical critique of masculinity, which led some to accuse it of glorifying chaos and promoting extremism. But not everyone was skeptical, as some critics praised Fincher's artistic direction and the gritty visual tone of the movie, pointing out his ability to bring the narrator's internal monologues to life on screen. However, the real profit of Fight Club came in the form of its cultural impact. It helped cement David Fincher as a filmmaker who could take dangerous, provocative material and turn it into something that stayed with you long after the credits rolled.
A cautionary tale about what to do with the anger that's engendered by your disenfranchisement.
After the chaos, cult status, and controversy of Fight Club, David Fincher took a sharp turn, stepping away from sweeping social commentary and philosophical anarchy to create something far more contained, but no less intense. Panic Room follows Meg Altman, a recently divorced woman, and her young daughter Sarah, as they move into a spacious Manhattan brownstone, a house they were talked into buying largely because of some type of state-of-the-art panic room that can protect them from any intruder or threat. Well, their first night takes a rather unsurprising turn when 3 intruders magically break into the house, searching for something hidden inside the panic room. What begins as a simple home invasion escalates into a relentless psychological chess match, as Meg and Sarah are forced to outthink and outlast the invaders from within the confines of their fortified shelter. But the panic room, a place meant to protect, becomes a trap in itself, isolating them with limited resources with no way out, while the criminals, growing desperate, become increasingly unhinged. Fincher, fresh off the polarizing reception of Fight Club, saw in Panic Room an opportunity to strip another script down. Even a contained thriller in Fincher's hands is anything but simple. He approached Panic Room with the same obsessive precision that defined his earlier work, designing elaborate 3D digital models of the house long before a single scene was shot. The film's set, a multi-story brownstone constructed entirely on a soundstage, was engineered specifically to allow the camera to pass through floors, walls, and keyholes, creating a sense of fluid motion in an otherwise claustrophobic space. Beneath the surface, Panic Room isn't just about survival. It's about the illusion of safety, the belief that money, technology, or architecture can insulate us from harm. The Panic Room itself, meant to be a sanctuary, turns into a prison. The budget for Panic Room was a reported $48 million, which was a significant amount for a movie primarily shot in one location. The modest budget was largely due to the intricate production design of the movie. Combine that with David Fincher's reputation for shooting dozens, sometimes hundreds of takes, which helped stretch the production time and compile the cost. However, this investment paid off tremendously. Upon release, Panic Room shot all the way to #1 at the box office and went on to gross over $197 million worldwide, nearly quadrupling its production budget, and that doesn't even include the home video sales and rentals, which were massive in the early 2000s and helped further solidify its profitability. Unlike some of Fincher's other works that gained a cult following years after release, Panic Room was a box office hit right away. The film currently holds a 76% critic rating, with the consensus pointing to its technical brilliance and the taut suspense that Fincher is so well known for. Critics largely agreed that while the story itself wasn't groundbreaking, the execution elevated it.
I wanted to do it. I got sent the script and I read it and I thought, this is what movies do great. You know, this is what movies can do that short stories can't do or opera can't do. It's immediate, and it's about simultaneously knowing all of these different things that if you weren't an audience in the cinema, you wouldn't be privy to.
Fincher's ability to turn a confined space into a dynamic, nerve-wracking arena of tension impressed many. While it may not have reached the cultural heights of Fight Club or Seven, Panic Room was a strong reminder that Fincher could deliver a high-concept thriller that pleased both audiences and studios. But while Panic Room was a tight commercial thriller confined to 4 walls, Fincher's next film would open up into something far more sprawling, slower, darker, and deeply unsettling. Zodiac follows the legendary decades-long hunt for the infamous Zodiac killer, a murderer who taunted police and media in the San Francisco Bay Area during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The story centers on 3 men, a crime reporter named Paul Avery, a police inspector called David Fincher, and most crucially, San Francisco Chronicle cartoonist Robert Graysmith, whose obsession with the case consumes him over the years. As the investigation stalls and leads dry up, it's Graysmith, not the cops, who keeps pulling at threads long after the case has gone cold. His descent into obsession becomes the emotional core of the film, as the line between detective work and personal unraveling begins to blur. Fincher had a personal connection to this case. He grew up in the Bay Area during the time of the Zodiac murders and remembered the fear that gripped the region.
I mean, I was interested in the story because as a kid, I grew up in the Bay Area and there was no happy ending for me, and it still fascinates me. And I think that's almost more compelling, the idea of what you learn through irresolution.
Fincher was adamant about staying true to the facts. He spent over 18 months with screenwriter James Vanderbilt, researching the real case, poring through police files, interviewing detectives, and obsessing over handwriting samples and timelines. It wasn't about glamorizing a killer, it was about obsession, both the Zodiacs and the people who hunted him. And for Fincher, Zodiac was personal. It was less about a killer on the loose, and more about the psychological toll of searching for a man who might never be found. Despite its gripping narrative, top-tier cast, and meticulous direction, Zodiac struggled to translate critical acclaim into box office dominance. The film had a reported budget of $65 million, a figure inflated by Fincher's demanding shooting style and the meticulous digital recreation of 1970s San Francisco. Yet, when it hit theaters in 2007, Zodiac only brought in $84 million worldwide. But once you factor in marketing costs, distribution fees, and the cut taken by theaters, Zodiac likely did not turn a profit during its theatrical run. It did, however, find a second life on DVD and streaming platforms, eventually building a loyal fanbase that helped soften its initial commercial underperformance. So while it wasn't a blockbuster, it became a slow-burning cult success. Critically, Zodiac was and still is one of Fincher's most celebrated works. It currently holds a 90% critic rating, with many critics praising its slow-burn tension, realism, and refusal to offer easy answers. But after dissecting the real-life horror of unsolved murder and journalistic obsession, Fincher would make a drastic pivot, not just in tone, but in scope. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button tells the story of a man who lives life in reverse. Born in New Orleans at the end of World War I with the physical appearance and ailments of an elderly man, Benjamin ages backward, growing younger as the years pass. As the world around him moves forward, he experiences life in a way no one else can, learning to walk long after he should have, falling in love in the middle of his life, and watching friends grow old while he becomes youthful. At the heart of the story is his complicated, bittersweet romance with Daisy, a woman whose life runs in the opposite direction. Their love peaks when their ages align, but time, relentless and unchangeable, eventually pulls them apart again. It's a haunting meditation on love, time, and the inevitability of loss. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is based on a short story written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It had been bouncing around Hollywood for decades. Studios tried and failed to bring it to life due to the sheer technical complexity of portraying a character aging in reverse. Not until David Fincher stepped in. Partnering again with Brad Pitt after Fight Club, Fincher took on the challenge, pushing digital filmmaking into uncharted territory. Fincher used a groundbreaking blend of motion capture, CGI, and heavy makeup to bring Benjamin's transformation to life, from wrinkled infant to youthful adult. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button came with a hefty budget of a reported $167 million, which was the highest amount Fincher had ever received for a movie at that point in time. Despite the risk, the gamble paid off financially. The film grossed around $335 million worldwide, more than doubling its production budget. However, due to Hollywood accounting practices and substantial marketing costs, its net profitability was likely more modest than the gross suggests. Still, the film proved to be a commercial success, an impressive feat for a nearly 3-hour drama with no traditional blockbuster elements, only relying on its emotional weight and quiet introspection to draw audiences in. This film also holds a 72% critic rating, with many moviegoers praising its emotional depth, storytelling, and visual effects. However, a few people also thought the movie was a drag, a twisted, less interesting version of Forrest Gump. Personally, this is one of my least favorite David Fincher films. Regardless though, I respect the de-aging technology used in this movie. Whatever visual sorcery they used to turn one of God's finest specimen and have him looking like Joe Biden, that type of technology needs to be given its just due. However, I get why some people love this story, because the Oscars certainly did. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button earned an impressive 13 Oscar nominations and went home with 3 of them: Best Art Direction, Best Makeup, and Best Visual Effects. Benjamin Button essentially proved that Fincher wasn't just another stereotypical genre director. He could tackle emotional sweeping epics just as effectively as his gritty crime dramas.
You talk about Benjamin Button, you can talk about this idea of an 85-year-old man who's really 6 years old inside, and it's just a different thing than when you see it. When you see it, you go, there's a whole different kind of emotional connection to it.
So after this ambitious scale and emotional depth, Fincher turned his lens towards something far more contemporary. His next project would chronicle the rise of one of the most powerful platforms in the world. The Social Network follows the story of Harvard student Mark Zuckerberg, a socially awkward genius who, after a brutal breakup, starts building a website that would eventually change the world. What starts as a college prank quickly evolves into an idea with global potential. Alongside his best friend and another business partner, Zuckerberg turns Facebook into a digital empire. But as the platform grows, so does the tension, the lawsuits, and the destruction of the very relationships that helped Zuckerberg build Facebook. The film reveals how ambition, insecurity, and the hunger for validation drove the people behind one of the most influential creations of the 21st century. The Social Network chronicles the birth of Facebook, not just as a tech giant, but as a cultural revolution that reshaped how billions connect. The Social Network is an adaptation of Ben Mesrick's book, The Accidental Billionaires. Aaron Sorkin was brought in to write the screenplay of the film, not to recreate the facts of Facebook's rise step by step, but to dramatize the emotional truths behind it. The Social Network doesn't present itself as a documentary. Instead, it uses the real-life conflict between Mark Zuckerberg and his partners as the canvas for a larger story about ambition and alienation. With a very modest $40 million budget, the film was relatively inexpensive to produce for a major studio release. Despite being a talk-heavy legal drama, The Social Network still grossed an impressive $224 million worldwide. It more than quadrupled its production cost, which is a rare feat for a film in its genre. It also had strong legs and continued to perform very well in theaters, thanks to strong word-of-mouth and critical acclaim. But its success didn't end at the box office. The film went on to generate significant revenue through home video sales, streaming rights, and licensing. With very minimal overhead beyond marketing and a focused production process, the return on investment was substantial. While many Hollywood dramas were struggling to break even at this point, especially those without action, spectacle, or franchise recognition, The Social Network became a textbook case of low-risk and high-reward filmmaking.
The third and fourth days of filming, we filmed the first scene of the movie, and it was probably the greatest experience I've ever had as an actor up until that time.
It currently holds a 96% critic rating, with the consensus calling it an ambitious example of modern filmmaking that captures the spirit of a generation. Jesse Eisenberg's performance as Mark Zuckerberg was also widely praised for its subtlety and complexity, portraying a socially awkward genius driven by ego, insecurity, and brilliance. However, some viewers, including Mark Zuckerberg himself, argued that the film sacrificed accuracy for drama, painting the Facebook founder in a more cynical light than reality.
And basically they frame it as if the whole reason for making Facebook and building something was because I wanted to get girls or wanted to get into some kind of social institution. And I mean, the reality for people who know me is I've actually been dating the same girl since before I started Facebook, so obviously that's not a part of it. But I think it's such a big disconnect from, I think, the way that people who make movies think about what we do in Silicon Valley, building stuff.
Ultimately, despite all the backlash and critics, The Social Network cemented itself as one of the most important films of the 21st century, and a defining moment in David Fincher's career. Now, Fincher was about to take another stark turn, trading legal drama for psychological torment, and a mystery buried in decades of violence and silence. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is about the story of a disgraced journalist, played by Daniel Craig, who is hired by a wealthy patriarch to solve the decades-old mystery of his niece's disappearance from a secluded Swedish island. He teams up with a brilliant but deeply traumatized hacker with a photographic memory, and the two uncover a twisted trail of family secrets, corruption, and violence. What begins as a cold case investigation soon spirals into something much darker, exposing decades of abuse and systemic misogyny hidden behind the veil of wealth and tradition. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was a bold American adaptation of the first book in Stieg Larsson's Millennium trilogy. The original Swedish film series had already achieved cult status, so adapting it for a global Hollywood audience meant Fincher had to strike a delicate balance of honoring the source material while bringing his own vision to it.
It's a very popular adaptation of a mass culture phenomenon. If the movie is great, I'm going to get too much credit, and if the movie sucks, I'm going to get too much blame.
Sony Pictures gave him a fairly large budget of $90 million, confident that Fincher's gritty style, Larsson's massive fanbase, and the film's dark allure would translate to box office success. Fincher insisted on filming in Sweden to preserve the cold, oppressive atmosphere that defines the story, and the result was a visually stunning, emotionally punishing thriller which is uncompromising in its tone. At the box office, the film grossed a respectable $232 million worldwide, making it a moderate commercial success. It performed better overseas than domestically, with international audiences accounting for over 60% of its total gross. While it didn't explode at the box office like a traditional blockbuster, it did recoup its budget and turn a profit thanks to strong legs, critical acclaim, and eventual home media sales. It wasn't a runaway financial hit by Hollywood standards, but for an R-rated nearly 3-hour mystery that dealt with sexual violence and familial horror, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo more than held its own. Its profitability helped affirm that mature adult-oriented thrillers still had a place in the modern cinematic landscape. The film currently holds an 86% critic rating, with many critics praising the boldness of David Fincher for taking on a project that already had a huge fanbase. highlighting his version as a cold and edgy adaptation of the book. However, some people thought it stayed too loyal to the book, leading to pacing issues and visual inconsistencies. Overall, this film was seen as a dark, uncompromising thriller that elevated pulp material into prestige cinema. After tackling the icy landscapes of Sweden and the secrets buried in old family wealth, Fincher turned his lens towards something far more intimate and terrifyingly close to home. Gone Girl begins with the sudden disappearance of Amy, a beautiful, intelligent woman who vanishes on the morning of her 5th wedding anniversary. Her husband Nick quickly becomes the prime suspect. As the media frenzy grows and public suspicion intensifies, cracks begin to form in Nick's carefully constructed facade, and soon, secrets about their seemingly perfect marriage begin to unravel. This story doesn't follow a conventional mystery structure, as halfway through the film, the narrative shifts dramatically, revealing Amy's perspective and exposing the truth of how she orchestrated her own disappearance to frame Nick for murder as revenge for his infidelity and emotional neglect. From there, Gone Girl transforms into a dark, twisted psychological thriller about control, perception, and manipulation. David Fincher masterfully guides the audience through multiple timelines, unreliable narrators, and shifting sympathies. One minute, you empathize with Amy, the next minute you empathize with Nick. And by the end of the film, you're not completely sure who to root for, as you slowly realize that the real horror isn't the crime or characters themselves, it's the toxic power dynamics in relationships and how public opinion can be weaponized. Gone Girl is a psychological thriller adapted from the acclaimed best-selling novel by Gillian Flynn, who also wrote the screenplay for the film. This project was brought to life at a time when the book had become a cultural phenomenon, praised for its sharp social commentary, dark tone, and shocking twists. Fincher, known for his fascination with flawed characters and twisted narratives, was a perfect fit. This is hands down one of my favorite David Fincher movies, and for someone who never read the book, the twist at the end really caught me off guard, and the ending made me question the whole movie. This film had a reported production budget of around $61 million, a sizable amount for a psychological thriller with no action set pieces or CGI spectacle. However, David Fincher and Ben Affleck's name, combined with the popularity of the source material and the buzz around its casting, turned the film into a box office draw. It went on to gross over $369 million worldwide, making it Fincher's highest-grossing film to date. It earned back its budget multiple times over, and was especially lucrative given its genre. For a dark, cynical thriller about marriage and manipulation, its commercial performance was almost unprecedented, proving that adult-oriented, story-driven films could still dominate the box office when executed with precision and star power.
You know, it starts as fundamentally a mystery, and then it becomes this perverse, absurdist thriller, and then it finally kind of becomes satire, and I hadn't seen that done.
The film currently holds an 88% critic rating, with many critics commending the film's razor-sharp commentary on marriage, media manipulation, and gender roles. Fincher's moody, suspenseful tone helped turn the domestic thriller into a cinematic event. Even though a few critics highlighted its cold, calculated style as emotionally distancing, most agreed that this precision was part of its brilliance.
You know, it's being kind of every aspect of being a woman. You know, you get to express the thing that's alluring and the thing that's repellent, and you get to create a facade, you get to strip it down. It's really exciting, that, but daunting, absolutely.
After Gone Girl, Fincher took a noticeable break from feature films and stepped into the world of high-end television with series like Mindhunter and House of Cards. But when he finally returned to the big screen, it was with his most personal project yet. Mank follows the story of Herman Mankiewicz, the witty and self-destructive screenwriter tasked with penning what would become one of the greatest films of all time, Citizen Kane. Set against the backdrop of 1930s and 1940s Hollywood, the film jumps back and forth in time, exploring Mank's complicated relationships with media mogul William Randolph Hearst, actress Marion Davies, and the powerful studio system that shaped and often stifled the creatives within it. The script was originally written by Fincher's father, Jack Fincher, in the 1990s. Jack Fincher was a journalist and aspiring screenwriter who had an incredible fascination with the legend surrounding the writing of Citizen Kane. He sought to tell the story from Mankiewicz's perspective, a man who, despite co-writing what many consider the greatest film ever made, had been largely forgotten. It wasn't until after Jack's death and Fincher's successful partnership with Netflix on Mindhunter that he was finally given the creative freedom and the budget to make Mank exactly as he envisioned.
So he just said, I want to try writing a screenplay. What should I write about? And I said,
when was this?
I'm going to say 1990, 1991, somewhere around there, before you were born. And I had these discussions with him, from a very early age about how important Citizen Kane was, that it was the greatest American movie ever made.
Mank was shot in stark black and white and styled to evoke the golden age of Hollywood. It became a passion project and a tribute for Fincher, both to the original screenwriter of Citizen Kane and to his father. Mank had a reported production budget of $25 million, funded entirely by Netflix, which also handled its distribution. And as with many Netflix originals, the exact revenue numbers are not publicly available due to the platform's streaming-first model and limited theatrical release. However, box office reports have estimated that it made around $100 million worldwide.
Hold on. Ty, I would like you to crunch those numbers again.
In truth, only Netflix knows how many people actually watched Mank and what kind of return it generated. But profitability wasn't necessarily the goal. This was a prestige play, a bid for awards recognition and artistic credibility, and in that regard, it succeeded. The film also earned 10 Oscar Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor, ultimately winning 2 Oscars for Best Cinematography and Best Production Design. Mank currently holds an 83% critic rating, with the consensus highlighting its sumptuous visuals, meticulous period detail, and strong performances, especially Gary Oldman's portrayal of Herman Mankiewicz. However, some critics thought the black and white style was too niche for general audiences, but regardless of that, David Fincher had managed to bring his father's dream to life. After crafting a period drama that paid tribute to old Hollywood's politics and artistry, Fincher pivoted back to familiar territory, back into the dark, methodical world of killers. The Killer follows the story of a nameless assassin, played by Michael Fassbender, who lives by a strict code of discipline, routine, and emotional detachment. But after a job in Paris goes wrong, his carefully controlled world begins to unravel. What follows is a globe-trotting revenge mission, as the killer goes after those who turned against him, not out of emotion, but out of necessity. After Fincher's success with Mank, he struck a 4-year exclusivity deal with Netflix, which opened the door for The Killer to finally get made. Netflix gave Fincher the creative freedom and budget he needed to bring this cerebral noir thriller to life. He teamed up with screenwriter Andrew Walker, who had previously collaborated with him on Seven. The two were a perfect match to adapt the graphic novel's introspective first-person style, especially since much of the film's tension relies not only on action, but on the killer's internal monologue and Fincher's meticulous direction. The Killer had an estimated budget of $175 million. Although Netflix hasn't officially confirmed this figure, the budget may also encompass Fincher's overall development deal with Netflix, making the actual production cost of The Killer potentially lower than reported. Officially, the film made around $100 million at the global box office. However, these numbers reflect the film's brief release in select theaters, designed to qualify it for awards and build early buzz, not to generate major theatrical revenue. The Killer currently holds an 85% critic rating, as many critics compared the film's cold, methodical tone and detached inner monologue to David Fincher's past work. However, others found the film's pacing too deliberate and the emotional detachment of the character too distant to fully engage in. While it may not rank among his most emotionally gripping or narratively complex films, it still stands as a sleek, cerebral thriller with sharp commentary on modern alienation, control, and professional detachment.
A group of people who are mostly strangers are sitting in the dark, and they've given you access to their brains through their eyes and their ears for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. That's a big responsibility.
So across 3 decades, David Fincher has proven that darkness can be beautiful, precision can be thrilling, and obsession can be cinematic. From brutal crime thrillers to haunting dramas, his films dig deep into the human psyche, exposing our need for control, our fear of the unknown, and the chaos that often lies just beneath the surface. Whether critically acclaimed, commercially successful, or cult classics, Fincher's work has left a lasting mark on modern cinema. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel for more budget and box office breakdowns. Thank you so much for watching.